I'm Donna Wilson of Bloomberg Radio, and today we're going to discuss an important issue. Median Black households have 10% of the wealth of comparable white households, and while Black Americans comprise 13% of the population, we hold less than 3% of its wealth. As recent protests sparked discussions about the roles of multi-generational wealth and wealth inequality, our discussion today will focus on what are the most effective ways to increase multi-generational wealth for Black and Hispanic Latino households, and what can be done to help stem the racial wealth gap. To help us understand this issue, we'd like to welcome our guests. Dr. Darrick Hamilton, he's the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Political Economy at the New School. He's also the co-creator of the baby bonds concept. We also have Dr. Valerie Wilson, the director of the Economic Policy Institute's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy. Welcome, you two. Thank you for joining us today. Darrick, according to the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, white families had more than 7 times the wealth of the average Black family in 2019, and that ratio of the wealth gap has not moved in decades. Why?
Well, if we were to summarize one single indicator, economic indicator of our racist past, it would be wealth. The ways in which wealth is generated is that it takes wealth to accumulate more wealth. In other words, wealth begets more wealth. We often think about wealth as an outcome, but perhaps its true essence is the capital it provides to give you agency, financial agency in your life. We know that if you want to be a homeowner, you're going to need a down payment. So, to simplify, the difference between a renter and a homeowner is a down payment. So if you have some capital, you can accumulate an asset in a passive way, accumulate wealth in a passive way over time. And Black people historically have been both economically and politically vulnerable when it comes to being able to accumulate assets and wealth. In essence, we are a subsistence population. We do not have the economic security that wealth has been affording some others for years and years and years. And there's a long history why.
And social and historical forces are behind those reasons, correct?
Yeah, I mean, we can look for examples all the time. We know that next year will mark the 100th anniversary of the riots in Tulsa. And there you have an example of a community that had been able to, establish businesses, accumulate some financial security, and it was politically vulnerable to literally terror, where without protections of the state, they were vulnerable to vigilante violence, and perhaps vigilante is not the correct word. Frankly, terror is the correct word, and whatever assets they accumulated were taken away. I mean, if we want to understand the way wealth is generated, we need only look to history, as you pointed out. Take, for example, the New Deal and post-war periods. The GI Bill, Fair Housing Authority, we created loan products, and we had government that provided capital for certain populations, but not for all populations. So a lot of that legislation from the New Deal and post-war was by design and implementation exclusionary of Blacks. What do I mean by implementation? In a Jim Crow context without a lot of federal oversight, the manner in which the programs were administered were racially disparate. We can look at the Department of Agriculture and Black farmers, for example. They certainly were not, right? That's a definite. And then one last point, and then we can move on. Legislatively, when you have programs like, I know you're going to talk about wages as well, Social Security, as well as the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act provided the ability for workers to collectively bargain against capital and really set the foundation for a labor movement to address the disparities between workers and capital at the time. And this was passed in the 1930s. But when you excluded domestic and agricultural workers from that legislation, and Black women were 90% likely to be in one of those categories, and over half of Black men were in that category, by design, you excluded Black people. And that was for the Faustian bargain so that the legislation could pass and get a largely Democratic Southern legislative body in Congress to go along with it. Black people's
All right.
interests were sacrificed.
Okay, I well understand, and of course, it's done by design. Valerie Wilson, while we understand that the Black and Hispanic households hold much less wealth than white households, there's also a huge disparity in wages. Blacks, for example, earn 61 cents for every dollar of income a white person earns, and the racial income gap has remained unchanged, even amid strong income growth in 2019. Some of the reasons why.
Yeah, I think, we can trace the history of the wage and income gap to a lot of the same causes that Derrick mentioned specifically because of the history of racial exclusion, discrimination, oppression, and exploitation in this country. Uh, Along with these disparities in wages comes a persistent 2-to-1 gap in unemployment rates. For example, the Black rate is typically double the white unemployment rate. In addition to that, for people who are able to become employed, we see patterns of occupational segregation where African Americans, Latinos are more likely to be excluded from higher paying occupations. So the combination of these disparities in employment, coupled with the wage gaps, contribute to those persistent income gaps that we've seen historically.
And with the current massive job losses during the current pandemic, the wealth and income gaps are expected to widen, correct?
Yeah, we're absolutely expecting those gaps to widen, in particular, the longer this recession drags on. I think some people had some hope over the summer as jobs started to return more quickly than had been predicted. But in September, we saw the pace of that job growth slow significantly. And slow significantly at a point where we're still seeing unemployment rates higher than they were even at the worst point of the Great Recession. And so the implications of that, in particular, for folks who lack wealth, who don't have savings to sort of tide them over until we get past this crisis, that's going to have significant implications for their wealth, for their income, for their housing stability, their health outcomes in the future.
Amazing. Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland President Loretta Mester says the U.S. economy can't reach its full potential until the country addresses the gaps in economic opportunity. So this question goes out to either of you. How will the U.S. economy benefit by closing the racial wealth gap? Derrick?
I mean, I'll lead with the point that we should do it because it's the right thing to do, that we need to have a moral and just economy. Take, for example, COVID. You've been talking about it. Clearly, the health implications, the fact that Black people have twice the mortality as white people, as well as, we know 40% of Black businesses closed as a result of this pandemic. So the implications of this pandemic are race specific also, and that links to a larger political economy vulnerability, whether we're in a pandemic or not. So that to me is an immoral economy. When somebody's identity matters as it relates to transactions, that's reason enough to change the economy. I know the narrative that people have about closing these gaps is good for everyone. And that may be true, and there's strong evidence to suggest that that's true. But to me, that can't be the driving reason why we do it, because that argument is context specific. For example, if we look at slavery, if we look at other periods of exploitation in American history, the economy was still growing, but yet that it was immoral. And to me, like I said, the moral imperative should be motivation enough that one's identity should not be linked in a transactional way as to whether you end up with more or less.
Okay, Dr. Wilson, Valerie, um, how will closing the racial wealth gap by helping the U.S. economy um, stem or raise GDP?
Yeah, so I appreciate Derrick's comment because we do often get caught up in just the mechanics of what that means for GDP or for the economy, to the detriment of really addressing the moral issue. But it's just plain macroeconomics. About two-thirds of GDP is accountable is I'm sorry is accounted for by consumer demand, the money that we all spend on the goods and services that we consume often on a regular basis. When we have such huge disparities in wealth, such huge disparities in income, a significant share of the population is not spending money, is not able to consume, is not able to purchase the things that they need as a necessity, as well as other kinds of goods and services. When that happens, just mathematically, GDP is going to be lower. And we've seen a lot of the research shows that in countries where you have a higher degree of economic inequality, economic growth is much lower in those places. I think the empirical case for why that's so can be demonstrated, as well as just the pure mathematics of how we calculate GDP in this country. And given that we are in a capitalist country, that unfortunately tends to be where we place most of the emphasis when we think about our motivations or reasons for needing to close that gap.
Yeah.
You've
And
both given
if
us
I
a
could just,
lot of, yes,
I was
go
going to
ahead.
jump real quick with perhaps some point of contention, and that is, I completely agree that in the contemporary context, our economy could grow better if we had a better resource population in general, inclusive of Black and Latinx. But the one slight pushback, and I don't even know if it's a pushback, is that racism can also be profitable. That in this contemporary context, we can we can have a better economy in general, but historically there have been other contexts where the economy has been able to grow as a result of exploitation and extrapolation. The question is for whom and how we measure our overall prosperity. And if we don't recognize that racism is profitable, then I don't think we'll properly be able to attack it, in my view. It ain't simply just due to bigotry and hatred. It's rather intended purposefully to extract from some in order to enrich others. And if that enrichment of others can lead to further investments that might lead to an overall higher GDP, that can't be reason enough to allow it to take place.
Understood. We have a Twitter poll question. Bloomberg Live had a Twitter poll question that said, what is the best way to increase multi-generational wealth for Black and Hispanic households? Number one, close the racial income gap. 40% of the people polled said that was the number one answer. Number two was nixing all student loan debt. 26.6% of the people said that that would be a way of increasing wealth for Blacks and Hispanic households. Number three was more small business loans. And number four was baby bonds for all kids. So I'd like your reaction to this, especially you, Darrick Hamilton, since you were the creator of the baby bonds concept.
My initial reaction is that, student loan debt. Let's say that's a righteous thing to do, and we should do it anyway. But the source of Black-white inequality has more to do with, from an accounting standpoint, differences in assets than it does differences in debt. And frankly, many Black households aren't even positioned in a place to accumulate debt. Now, it is the case that when it comes to student loan debt, when a Black person goes to college and a white person goes to college, the Black person 4 years after graduation ends up with about $54,000 in student loan debt in comparison to about $30,000 for the typical white family. And that's just too high, period, even for a white family. So again, from an economic just perspective, in this country, we have a plentiful enough amount of resources so that we can provide everybody in the 21st century with a debt-free college education and not saddle our young people with the albatross of debt so that they're struggling in I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, in a sharecropping scenario where they're working to pay back debtors. But that said, the number one reason for the differences between racial wealth gap is assets itself. And what generates assets, like I mentioned earlier, it's that capital foundation to put you in some vehicle of automatic savings over your lifetime, like a home, like some seed capital to start a business if you have some entrepreneurial idea, or like some college degree that puts you in a managerial or professional occupation without the albatross of debt. So the specifics of what you do with that capital, in my view, should be up to you. But it is capital itself that is the explanation for the black-white wealth gap.
Valerie Wilson, before we even talk about the baby bonds with Darrick, let's talk about other ways in which we can help build Black wealth, other pathways. Would home ownership, you mentioned, go ahead.
So, home ownership is often credited as being a significant contributor because often for families who do have wealth and have assets, the largest asset that they have is a home. We know that there is a disparity in home ownership in this country. About 40% of Black households own their home compared to about 3/4 of white households. But even if we were to just close that gap in home ownership, there are multiple layers of inequality in terms of the asset of a home. One being disparity in home equity, the overall value of a home. There has been multitudes of documentation and research showing that homes in communities where the majority of the residents are Black tend to have lower values, appreciate much less and much slower than do homes in majority white neighborhoods. There's been research showing that there are disparities in terms of tax assessments, and that affects the amount of wealth that people are able to build through home ownership. So I tend to think it's not a single solution to addressing the wealth gap. I think that we need to address it on multiple fronts, including many of the reasons that people need wealth, that people have to draw from their wealth. We talked earlier about the disparity in income and wages. One of the reasons that wealth is beneficial is because if you become unemployed, either because of the economic cycle, if you have a health situation that requires that you stay home, if you choose to stay home for care responsibilities or other reasons, having wealth is able to fill in that gap of the income one would normally earn through working. And so I think we need to address the asset component, the debt component, as well as disparities in the reasons why people need wealth.
What about financial institutions investing in Black banks? How will that help stem the gap? Valerie?
So I think, investing in Black banks, again, is a positive thing to do. I don't think it would be detrimental to the wealth gap, but I tend to think that it would not move the needle a huge amount. One, because there are just a few of those institutions, and they tend to be smaller institutions. I think we need to address the broader systemic and structural issues with lending and access to capital in this country, including a number of the predatory practices that, in fact, extract wealth from communities of color when people are able to acquire assets.
Okay, Darrick Hamilton, you are the co-creator of the baby bonds that we have that has generated a lot of national attention. So can you share with us how baby bonds can help close or reduce the staggering gap?
I think the conversation is highlighting that the source of inequality is capital itself. And the point is, Black people have been denied the ability to accumulate capital. And when they did accumulate capital, it was politically vulnerable to confiscation or other private interests. What baby bonds is intended to do is to provide everyone at birth a capital foundation and a trust account that will be managed by the federal government and reserved for that child, and when they become an adult, to be used towards some asset enhancing endeavor. So again, it is a trust fund that's progressively seeded. So if you're born into the most wealth poor family, you would get upwards to $60,000 to $50,000. But it would be universal, just like Social Security, to promote a stakeholder society, that we're in it together. But regardless of your gender, your race, and your financial position at birth, everyone would have an opportunity to accumulate the economic security that is provided with an asset as a result of baby bonds. Really quick, Black people are a subsistence population because they lack a capital foundation. And they lack a capital foundation not because of any actions of their own, but because of our larger political economy that has devalued their presence because of their race. And why did they do
So
it?
what can be done? So what can be done? What can be
Yep. So
done?
baby bonds is a prospective policy that by design and implementation is anti-racist. That's one policy. But frankly, the other big policy is reparations. So when the nation is really ready to grapple with its sordid past, we will have that truth and reconciliation to document and atone for all those historical acts that we've been describing, and that will be empty without some form of redress. And reparations will provide that in a retrospective way, and if coupled with baby bonds, could lead to a more moral and just economy. And it will benefit white people also, because the ways in which we characterize poverty is very racialized. White poor people are racialized in the explanation for why they're poor. With that truth and reconciliation, we will no longer be able to define poverty as deficits within people, but rather where it centers, which is resources.
So as we come up to about the final couple of minutes in our interview, I'd like for you, Valerie, to drive the message home for our audience in your closing remarks, how the racial wealth gap will benefit, by closing it, will benefit the entire U.S. economy.
So I think that we can consider a number of things that we've discussed a bit here today. Darrick mentioned the idea of reparations as a way of closing the wealth gap. We talked a bit about free college education and public and tuition in public universities. I don't remember we got into healthcare, but health expenses are another thing that tends to drain wealth and resources from families. At least two of these things, college education and healthcare, are things that are universal, that are relatable to most people in this country. And there are countries around the world that make these things available to their population. On the issue of reparations, it's not a completely foreign idea either. We have done that before in this country, in particular with the victims of Japanese internment. So I think that as we grapple with addressing and closing the wealth gap, we have to address the moral issues that have already been described. But we also have to consider that a lot of the things that we can do to address the consequences, if you will, of not having wealth in this country are things that will be beneficial to a large segment, if not all, of our population.
Okay, and we have about 30 seconds, Darrick. Any final comments you'd like to share before we close out this segment?
I'm just going to end with appreciation of both you and especially Valerie, my longtime friend and colleague from graduate school. I'm always pleased to share stage with her.